to this series where we've been talking about talent management insights across different industries, different themes. We have, over the series, invited industry veterans to share their insights. Our guest on this episode is yet another industry veteran. He has over 36 years of corporate experience in areas such as sales and operations, leadership and organizational change and transformation, and he's worked across a wide variety of industries. He's been focused on IT and the manufacturing domain, as well as he has consulted across industries like IT, finance, banking and insurance, manufacturing, government, hospitality. He's a global Indian. He has lived and worked in Singapore, US, and Canada, in addition to having traveled across 25 different countries. So, without much ado, I would like to welcome Anand Pillai, the Managing Director of Leadership Matters, to this session of Leadership Insights. Welcome, Anand.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be back in this series.
Yes, it's great to continue the discussions which we've had in the past, Anand. We've spoken about the Great Resignation. We've spoken about high potential candidates. We've spoken across various interesting topics. For this series, I would like to talk about something which matters to a lot of us as growing professionals. It would be great if we can talk about how we could ideally transition into various CXO roles. I think with all that's happening in the world around us, we see a lot of exits. We see people moving from startups back to core industries. We see a lot of transitions happening. So I think in this backdrop, I'd like to understand your views in terms of what it is that talent should be looking out in terms of transitioning into CXO roles? What are the various factors which they should bear in mind?
Thank you. Vikram, that's a very interesting question, but I want to take that question two steps backward. The reason why I want to take it two steps backward is, yes, it is desirable, it is aspirational for anybody to become a CXO. Chief Finance Officer, Chief Transformation Officer, Chief Technology Officer, Chief People Officer, whatever. But before that, the person must get into another role or another two roles thing. So the first one, anybody before he or she aspires to become a chief, whatever, XO, finance, people, technology, the person must necessarily master their own function or domain. So they should really effectively get into the head of that particular function. So head of finance or head of people or head of HR or head of technology or whatever. In that particular role, the person will be what I would call, or what anybody would call, a functional specialist or a domain expert in that particular role. But that is two levels below the CXO. After that, unfortunately, even though the designation exists, people don't really fulfill the designation in all its entirety, and that is general manager. See, I, way back in 1993, I was a general manager in an American company. And general manager in an American company is actually a very senior designation.
Correct.
I also did not know. I thought, okay, the general manager. But it is in every sense of the word that general was very important. That means you will have a functional knowledge of the other areas. You are a general. You definitely are. So, for example, if you're general manager sales, you definitely are looking at sales as the function, but you are also, looking at finance. You cannot be effectively a general manager if you are not exposed into marketing, if you're not exposed into people and so on. So that is a precursor to what we would have today as a CXO role. So from that head of function, the person must graduate into the CXO role, into the general role. Now, the general happens by way of rotation. And I have what is known in the industry but I think I was among the few people in the early 90s to have coined this particular formula. And the formula is 2 by 2 by 2. So why do I say 2 by 2 by 2? So this general or this exposure or experience and exposure, you must have experience and exposure in at least two product or service lines of the company. So I come from an IT background. So in the IT industry, you've got SAP practice, you've got Oracle practice, you've got infrastructure practice, you've got your entire middleware practice, you've got your technology practice. That could be the horizontal. There are verticals. Verticals is life sciences, healthcare, pharma, travel, transportation, logistics, banking, finance, energy and utilities, government and public sector, automotive, aerospace, airline, and so on. So you must have experience and exposure in at least two of these products or services for you to be having that aspirational C role. That has to be there. Minimum two. Definitely required
More is
that you
welcome.
have,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
but minimum two. Experience and exposure. It's not just exposure.
Mhm.
Experience also, in depth, having handled that responsibility. So product or service lines is the first. The second two would be you must have experience and exposure in minimum two geographies that the company is existing in. Now, for example, in an IT company largely are global companies, but they will have their delivery center in Bangalore or in Chennai or in Hyderabad or in Pune or wherever. Now,
Yes.
if you have that experience and exposure as a delivery manager, but largely in only Pune or in largely Bangalore or largely um, Hyderabad or Chennai or wherever, you will not have the geographic exposure, you will not have the cultural exposure, you will really not understand the cultural nuances. You must live and work. Traveling is different, but you must actually live and work in many of these geographies, and they need to be distinctly different geographies. It cannot be, for example, Bangalore and Hyderabad, or it cannot be Gurgaon and Noida. It has to be distinctly different geographies, or very specifically culturally distinct
Correct.
geographies. So,
Correct.
for example, when I was working in Singapore on handling the Southeast Asia region, the culture, the orientation, it was very, very different. How Japan behaved was very different from how Malaysia behaved, or from how Indonesia behaved. But that exposure gave me a different dimension. But when I went to the Americas, based in US and Canada, that exposure was completely different.
Correct.
For a brief time, I was based in UK.
Yeah.
That exposure is completely different. So
Correct.
the second stint, experience and exposure that a person must have, in addition to that product or service lines, is the geography, because that is what will enable the person to have a global outlook. The third parameter is you must have experience and exposure in minimum two of the five critical functions of the company. And this should be mainline functions. So what are the mainline functions? Mainline functions definitely is finance. Mainline functions definitely is operations, technology, HR, marketing, sales and marketing, and so on. Now, you may be a salesperson, you may be a HR person, you may be a technology person, you may have had experience and exposure in two practice lines, you may have experience and exposure in two geographies. But if you have not had experience and exposure in the other functions, then you really are only a domain expert, but not an actual chief. The word chief carries a big responsibility. So
Correct.
let us say I become the chief. I mean, I earlier currently I'm also playing the role chief transformation officer. Now, obviously, I cannot talk about chief transformation only from a technology point of view, only from a people point of view, or only from a finance or business process point of view. Let us say I become the chief. I was earlier the chief human resource or people officer. Now, when I was a chief people officer, I cannot look at only people problems. I
Correct.
will have to look at people from a business side. What is
Correct.
the business impact? What is the cost of hiring? What is the cost of attrition? What is the cost of moving a particular talent? So I must wear the finance hat while I'm doing the people function. I
Correct.
must wear the marketing hat while I'm doing the people function. I must wear the technology hat while I'm doing the people function. So after you graduate from being a functional expert, you must have experience and exposure in minimum two functions.
Yeah.
So let me summarize this two by two by two. A person aspiring to become a chief, whatever officer, is one who has had experience and exposure in two product or service lines
Mhm.
of the company and main product or service line.
Correct.
It should
Correct.
not be something ancillary.
Yes,
The
not
second one is
yeah.
in two geographies that the company is having more than 10 to 15% of its revenue coming from. You
Mhm.
must have experience and exposure because you need to understand the customer ethos, you need to understand the employee ethos. And of course, you must have experience and exposure in minimum two of the functions, core functions of the company: marketing, finance, technology, HR, and so on.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, today, because of the great resignation drama or because of the great attrition or whatever, people are getting glorified position. I know of several people who are performing the role of, let us say, CHRO or CTO, but they have no clue on the other functions.
Mhm.
Technically speaking, they
Mhm.
are actually head of HR or head of technology or head of people or something like that. They are not actual chiefs. They may have got the designation, but they are not performing the role because that C entitles you to sit on the board and sit on the operations review team or in the steering committee team or in the executive council. Now, if you go to the executive council as a head of finance, assuming hypothetically, you will have a myopic view. You'll
Mhm.
only talk about finance. You'll never be able to appreciate the marketing person's view. You'll never be appreciate the production person's view or the delivery person's view. But if you handle that from that experience and exposure in the other areas, you will have a synergistic conversation, a
Mhm.
collaborative atmosphere.
So I think what, in essence, what we're saying is when one aspires to be in that CXO role, and the C, the chief, it requires you to have a lot more width than just depth. And when you're sitting on
Absolutely.
the board, as you put it, one has to have a broader view of things. And in trying to follow this philosophy, Anand, the to products or services, to geographies, to functions. And one also sees that there's a lot of mobility among senior talent. So, do you feel that there is merit in somebody trying to follow this two by two matrix within a given function or an industry? Or do you think someone who gathers this width of experience and exposure across different companies or different industries for that matter, how would you look at somebody who spent all their time in one industry versus somebody who's been moving across industries? Which candidate would you prefer?
Yeah. So first of all, I am not a big propagator of moving across companies. I'm
Okay.
not. You
Mhm.
know, most companies are diversified well enough. Most companies are diversified well enough, and therefore you can actually get this two by two without shifting companies. I have, as I'm talking to you, 40 years of experience, but this is largely in five companies. I
Correct.
worked for 10 long years in the Tatas. I worked for 6 years in two American companies. And then I worked for 14 years in one company, close to 14 years in one company, which is HCL Technologies. And my last corporate role was with Reliance Industries as the Chief Learning Officer.
Mhm.
But I was also handling business transformation. Now, if you look back, I've largely been in the IT industry.
Mhm.
But when I was in that senior role in HCL, I was exposed to all the other practice lines: energy and utilities,
Mhm.
travel, transportation, and logistics,
Mhm.
life sciences, healthcare, pharma,
Mhm.
banking, finance, and insurance, aerospace, airline, automotive. So while I was in the IT part of it, I would never have been a successful IT professional if I did not understand the automotive technology, if I did not understand the aerospace technology, because I had to handle the business problems of these clients,
Mhm.
life sciences, healthcare, pharma, and so on. So while I was within space, a particular industry, I
Mhm.
was exposed to the other practices and product lines.
Mhm.
Quite interestingly, I had a diametric shift from HCL Technologies, a known IT company, into Reliance Industries, which was a hydrocarbon company.
Correct.
You know,
Very
so
diversified
there is no correlation
manufacturing.
between
Yeah.
IT and hydrocarbons. That
Correct.
was largely in upstream, midstream, and downstream. But
Yeah.
the reason why I was successful in that was because I had handled the energy and utility sector. I had handled many of these verticals and created what we call DCG, or domain competency groups. So
Mhm.
similarly, I have to create those domain competency groups here.
Mhm.
I have to create the functional experts in exploration and production. I have to create the functional experts in refining and marketing, in downstream petrochemicals, polyester, polymer, aromatics, heavy chemicals, and so on. So once you understand these nuances, you can cut across industries, but you need to be minimum, 3 to 5 years in a particular role for you to really get the in depth and breadth of that particular function. So, coming back to your question, we possibly can dwell on that longevity later on, but I strongly propagate you growing within the company. And if you look at the world's best leadership factories,
Mhm. Mhm.
at one point in time was a leadership factory. Unilever is a leadership factory. Procter and Gamble is a leadership factory. ITC is a leadership factory, and so on. So these are all companies which home grow their leaders. They go across these functions, across these domains, across these practices, but they move up the corporate ladder rather than jumping from one company to the other.
Okay, so what in essence what you're saying is it would be best to stay and grow within a certain company or an industry, but if an opportunity presents itself, possibly at senior levels, one is able to make that transition across industries, across verticals, and that's by virtue of the competencies which we have gathered along the way, right? Yeah,
Absolutely. And let me,
yeah,
give you the merits and demerits, the pros and cons of staying in the same
sure,
company.
sure.
We need to look at both sides of the
Correct, correct,
coin.
yeah,
First,
yeah.
let me look at the pros. What are the benefits of staying in the same role? The biggest benefit that you get in staying in the same role is you understand the unwritten rules of the game of the company. Because, I mean, contrary to popular belief, not everything that you do is according to a JD or a KRA or KP. Let us be bluntly clear
JD
about that.
exists. JD exists only at the time of an interview. So I think after
Absolutely. It may be there for performance appraisal or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
But when I perform my role, I will broadly adhere to the JD, but
correct,
I will do things following the unwritten rules of the game, or the unwritten WOW, ways of working of the company.
correct.
That is best known by a person who is there within the. That's the first and the biggest benefit. The second benefit is linked with that, is the person understands the culture, understands the character of the organization. It cannot be spelt out. It is not really, I mean, again, I go beyond, just like I go beyond the JD into the unwritten rules, I go in the culture beyond the mission, vision, values. I'll tell you one thing. I don't know any company which is literally living the mission, vision, values and not creating a culture around.
Yeah,
So that is the second biggest benefit. The person understands and lives and embodies or personifies the culture. Biggest benefit in staying long in a company. The third one is what I would call stakeholder management. When you work in a particular company, you know the people personally, you know the people formally as well as informally. And
correct.
all of us know that for a particular person in any role, for him or her to be successful, he will have to learn to influence people. I
Mhm.
am on the kind of recruiting board of many of these leading executive search firms. And one of the things that we look for is how good is this person when it comes to working with people, when it
Correct.
comes to working across domains. So let me summarize what are the three big benefits for a person staying in a particular role. The three big benefits is first is he or she knows the unwritten rules of the game. Beyond the JD, they know what needs to be done to get things done. That's the first one. The second one is the person lives and embodies the culture very well, beyond the mission, vision, and values. And the third one is the person knows how to get things done or manages stakeholders because he has got a set of working relationships, both from people who are being part of his own team as well as the others. That is the benefit. And these three are critical success factors for a particular person to make an impact in an organization.
Correct.
Having said that, there are also drawbacks.
Mhm.
Let me give you the three drawbacks. The first and possibly the biggest drawback is what I would call a myopic thinking. You are thinking only within the industry. And if you have not handled that three by three by three, it is quite possible that you can get what is also known as a frog in the well approach, or you're just looking
Yeah, yeah,
inward.
yeah.
You are not exposed to the outside. So
Correct.
that can be a danger, but it can be overcome by you having exposure in other areas, in other geographies, in other practices. But you still tend to get boxed in to one particular type. That is a big drawback. The second one is there is a tendency, and some people can actually become more victim to it, tendency to be subjective. Now, I'll tell you one thing, with all due respect, if you ask me, I mean, is the best boutique consulting company, I would say Leadership Matters. Why? Because I'm very subjective. You know, I mean, I'm very attached
Correct.
to it. It
Correct.
is quite possible that I don't know the gaps. For
Yeah.
example, if you were to do an edit of a document that you have written, you are not the best person to do the editing because
Yeah.
you're not able to see the gaps. So
Correct.
the second challenge that can happen is it is quite possible that you become subjective to some of the, or you become very passionately advocating,
You identify
and
too closely with the whole
you're not
thing.
able to see the problem. You're not able to see the problem. Albert Einstein said a significant amount of the problems cannot be solved by the very people who created them. So if you are a part of the problem,
Yeah.
you are there in the company, obviously you will not have the outside in
Correct.
perspective.
Correct.
And that can be overcome with the two by two by two, but it has to be very well structured. That is the second disadvantage. The third disadvantage that can happen is you can have your own, what I would call political power center.
Mhm.
Just like I told, stakeholder management. So you got your own political power sectors. So you would, in fact, a negative word of using of saying that you got your own coterie. So
Yes.
what happens is you built your own territory, you built your own fortress,
Yeah.
and you will not help anybody penetrate. You'll
Yeah.
not be open for an outside in view. You'll
Yeah.
not be open for an outside perspective. These
Mhm.
are drawbacks which, if you're conscious of it, you can definitely address that. But the drawbacks are nothing compared to the big benefits that come from a person who is long enough in a company to really add that value.
I think that's a very balanced view you've given us, Anand. I have one last question before we wrap up this episode. From in terms of aspiring for a CXO role, and they say it's lonely at the top. So, is the CXO role meant for everybody? Is a CXO role the natural progression and the end objective of every leadership professional, or are there things which one can aspire for beyond being a CXO?
See, it also depends on the orientation of the person. Some people, by nature, tend to become specialists. I mean, that's who they are. and there are certain functions that possibly push it more than other functions. I'll give you two functions definitely. One is the finance function, and the other is the legal function. So if you look at the finance function, a CA, for example, I mean, very rarely will a CA think marketing. He'll always think numbers, numbers, numbers. A legal person is always policies, laws, and stuff
Yeah.
like that. That these are all what I would call specialists. Okay, but there are people I know of, very good finance people who have had very good exposure in marketing, or very good exposure in operations or in technology, but those are few, because they tend to become specialists. So are you oriented towards becoming a specialist or a generalist? I mean, I started my career way back in 1982, 83 as a Unix systems administrator, and I mean, I was a nerd character, doing whatever was necessary in all the technology and operations. And then I quickly moved into product development and product management and program management and so on. I could have kind of dwelt in that particular domain, but I know if I did, I would not have grown as much or matured as much as when I shifted into marketing and shifted into program management and shifted into international operations. In many companies, for example, Japanese companies, they encourage specialists more than they encourage generalists.
Yeah.
American companies encourage generalists more than they encourage specialists. They will hire, the so-called specialists, but they will be individual contributors rather than team leaders. So in companies like IBM, for example, they have growth tracks in both the individual contributor role as well as in the generalist role. Although the biggest and the largest number of roles are there in the general category, where you've got all the 2 by 2 by 2, they have specialist roles, and they would call them fellow. So if a particular person is an IBM fellow, his or her salary may be as much as the CXO itself. But that person is filing patents, the person is really doing something extraordinary in their particular area. Those numbers are few, but so you'll have to take a call right in the somewhere in mid your career. Am I fit for a generalist role, or am I fit for a specialist role? And accordingly grow yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Anand, for some of these insights. I think you've brought things out at a very simple and pragmatic way about how a CXO aspirant should not only have that depth but also the width which comes across going through different product lines and services, different geographies, different functions. And I think it's really interesting that the whole general manager concept, which used to be a big designation back in the day, it somehow lost its significance in the age of directors and VPs, and I think the fancier designations have taken over, but there's a lot of merit in being in that GM role, and I think that's really where you get incubated and forged to be the next chief officer of whichever company or role. And I think it's also very insightful how you've brought out the pros and cons of being in the same company versus moving on. So I think these would all be interesting gems to all our viewers and listeners. Thank you again, Anand, for this great episode. See you soon on the next
Yes.
episode.